Greetings, YouTube. Lester Crone Strolling Bones coming at you. This is a response to RobertJFreemantle's video concerning one-on-one solo adventures. I like to call these intro adventures. Personally, I've used these lots before, and I think it's very interesting. The similarities we seem to share. You were into solo adventure books as a kid. I was too, with different games. I played Lone Wolf and you played Fighting Fantasy, but still a similar experience where it's when it's more one-on-one, you definitely have an easier connection. That's one of a game master's hardest jobs, is to be able to get everybody committed to the story and keep them interested and wanting to play, and wanting to play not just rolling with it, but to actually create story themselves. And I find that solo adventures are not only good for creating a player's understanding of the system, which I think is probably its most useful aspect, or the most useful thing you can glean from that is the fact that it does help teach the system, where you can focus on one person. If they have questions, you can answer them immediately while not having to worry about boring other people. And I think that's its most shining feature. But at the same time, it helps to create that cohesive story, like you were saying. And my findings have been that if a character goes through that, they definitely are more engaged in the story, and they have something personal that they can tell, an account that they went through. Now, that's one thing that I find with their Fated Travels, is like you said in the video where you talk about it, talk about the experience. I guess it does. There's more of an element of danger when you know that these characters are actually going through these circumstances and they're not just being created by the writer. Like the circumstance may have been come up with by the writer, but the way it is solved and the events and the unfolding of the events is definitely more random and therefore more dangerous. I find that players who have experienced that buy into the system more, buy into the game more. And by the system, I guess I shouldn't say system, because system I would equate to the actual mechanics of the game. So they'll buy into the story more, the process of role playing. And I've had about 6 players, I think, over the last year who I've introduced to the game, all of which are new to role playing for the most part. I'm slowly planning a series of videos where I interview each and every one of them that wants to. But anyway, I ran solo adventures for all of them, except for one. One guy didn't feel like running a solo adventure, and his character's concept kind of made sense. I still would have liked to have run the session to give him an experience, and to give him experience within the mechanics, because I find that he is more sluggish when it comes time to following the steps and playing the game itself. I find he's sluggish at that, and that he's not as interested because his character doesn't have any kind of vested interest or stock in most of the situations, because it's early game. There's nothing, he hasn't really built a story around his character yet. So I think that helps immensely. Very, very, very good suggestion, and I'm glad you brought that up. I don't think that I've seen that so far on YouTube. There might be a video out there that concerns this, but or that discusses this, but I absolutely adore that tactic, I guess, that game master's trick. It's a great way to learn the system yourself, great way to teach other people the system, and a great way to bring people into the story. If I were to have any suggestions on it, I would say to keep it as short as possible. I tried to run 1, maybe 2 encounters, and to throw in situations where they need to use the main elements of the game. So like skill checks. I like to start with just a characteristic type check, so they understand that the characteristics are the overarching underlying ability, I guess, of their characters, and then that to show that those are augmented by training in other areas, so skill checks, or if you have feats or talents, or whatever. But I like to work it up, give them a check, combat check, let them understand how initiative and how combat works, let them understand usually social, stealth, investigation, and combat. I like to try to throw those at the player. Obviously, I like to focus on what their character's concept is. So if it's a combat character, focus more so on combat. But my advice would be to keep it short. Try not to have it be too long. The way I ran it is, it was over 2 days where I created characters with these players, and I ran 2 solo sessions each of those days. And on the second day, we actually ended up playing and had a really funny circumstance. And it was very silly. We played for only an hour because we had run the solo adventure to allow the wizard to understand the mechanics of the game. The wizard mechanics in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the 3rd edition, are much more complex than the standard melee class our careers. And anyway, I ran it was about an hour with him, and then we ended up getting to play an hour with everybody else. And everybody else already had kind of this little backstory for their character that they had experienced. And the whole session, when the group got together, was brilliant because they had kind of discussed slightly why they were together as a team. They decided they were a group of ne'er-do-wells. They ended up in a spot, a trouble. They were at not a tavern, they were at a shop. Basically, they went to a weapons store, and a bunch of funny things happened, and essentially the wizard ended up selling bolts back to the owner of the shop because they had distracted him so well. The elven hunter managed to steal an elven short sword off the wall, because he had noticed that it was an elven short sword and kind of investigated it and realized that the owner of the store realized that it was of high quality but didn't know that it was an elven sword. And they all just kind of worked together using pieces of their characters and kind of bringing their characters into the story more because they'd already had that one experience. And it seemed to go relatively quickly with rules because everybody had created their character already and everybody understood the mechanics, and it's perfect. That's the best way to go about getting a new group together. If you have an experienced or beardy group, then they may not necessarily need that. If they know the system, they can sit down, they can discuss the backgrounds of their characters, they know the mechanics, and you can get right on playing. But for new characters, I can't think of a better way of getting a new group together than doing one-on-one solo adventures with each of the characters individually. Introduce them to the system, pamper them a little bit so that they get a good feeling, and so that they're more engaged in the game when it comes time to play with a whole bunch of people, and you have to, as the game master, worry about keeping everybody interested, keeping everybody on point. Anyway, I like where you're going with a lot of your gaming talk videos. I think this is what inspired me the most on YouTube to make videos, was to respond to other people's questions. So if I were to ask a question related to this, it would be, what are some of the experiences that you've had playing these one-on-one solo adventures? Or if you see this video for the first time, you like the idea, well, go do a one-on-one solo adventure with a new player and see how it works, and then relate your experience here. I'm going to give you one which was, I thought it was quite good. This guy is very brand new to role-playing, and I'm trying to get him interested because it's something I guarantee he would like once he really got into it and understood how it worked. And anyway, he wanted to play the Dwarven Ironbreaker because the picture was the nicest. Plus he likes dwarves, plus the guy's got badass armor. So he plays the Dwarven Ironbreaker, and we set up this story. I created the story it took me about 25 minutes to half an hour to whip it up. I drew up a quick little map. I created the names of 5 different NPC characters, one of them being the king, or the lord of the specific dwarven hold. And then I set it up where he came back from consciousness, and I had him, he opens his eyes, kind of like that moment in Saving Private Ryan where everything's it's all blurry and it's slow motion kind of, and the sound's all muted and washed out. Anyway, he wakes up being picked up by the hand by one of his comrades, and they're standing in a hallway in the Dwarven Karak, and they're holding off wave after wave of goblin, and I have it set up so X number of waves of goblins will come, so he gets experience with combat. So he ends up cleaving through these people. He learns about the different fatigue mechanics. He learns about how to assemble a dice pool to make attacks, and how to be descriptive with that. I encouraged that because I attacked him first, and I took turns first to show him kind of how it worked. And then once he got into it, he really was starting to dig it. But once the combat kind of hit him, I took him out of that really quickly to give him another quick experience because he was really engaged in the story. So I then took him out of the combat and made them have to retreat. So he then had to do athletics skills checks to see how fast he could get to the end compared to these raging goblins that were coming after him. And he managed to succeed like super epically. So he made it to the door and managed to swing the doors wide open to the throne room and get the king inside. And then, or get the Lord inside. Then they closed the doors and barred them. And then there was a little bit of social interaction, and then all hell broke loose as the goblins broke through. I made him have to use observation check to find the way out, the secret way out of the throne room. And then as he did, he had to use stealth checks to avoid the enemy walking through these tunnels to get out of it's basically an escape tunnel. And then once he got out, he had to do a social check with a traveler, it was a farmer with a wagon who was heading to the nearest town, and he saw the dwarf, and the dwarf was covered in blood, obviously, and all injured, and so I gave him penalties to his roll, but he had to basically do a social interaction to hitch a ride to the next town. Needless to say, he didn't put a lot of points into his fellowship or charisma, and he failed and ended up having to sleep in the camp. But he got a thorough experience, and it took about 45 minutes in total to play the whole encounter, so just over an hour to prep it and play it. And I just think that's one of my great experiences doing a one-on-one solo adventure. So I'd like to hear from the rest of the community. Do you like this idea? If you do, have you used it before? If you have, what are some of the experiences that you have used? Have a good time, guys. Keep gaming. Peace.